say. Already I have the sense that I'm very indebted to all the speakers that have come before, because what I hope is that I'll be able to pay forward all of the good ideas that they've been bringing up and sort of build on some of them. So I hope I do everyone justice. Fellow nostalgics, lamenters, and dreamers of a better tomorrow, we find ourselves at a time of great malaise and decrepitude. We fight among ourselves incessantly, perhaps not in this room so much, but certainly among fellow travelers, as well as our countrymen, like warring realms. We offer too little and demand too much. Even the best of us scheme, and the worst of us, best of all. Unable to imagine the conquests, discoveries, and achievements of our past, instead, we covet and preserve our shrinking possessions. But we've been here before, and there is a path out. Before we act, though, we must know how to, and we are adrift in a sea of theory and analysis, sure of a broad trajectory, but not specifics. We know what we ought to avoid and what to shun, but not what to embrace and pursue. Even I've been caught in this trap, in study of revolutions from every possible angle, revolutions from above and below, from without and within. And in these efforts, I believe I have come upon what is surely an answer to our problems: restoration. Whether revolution tries to wipe the slate clean and rebuild in the shape of perfect forms, state, society, or even man, restoration instead takes these things as entities in motion and something real, not abstract. It sees a shadow of what was once great, or had the essence of greatness in it, and tries to put the pieces back together as best they can. The past can never be fully restored, but as a goal, it is always far more realistic and productive than the utopian musings of bloodthirsty revolutionaries. Our own example of this division were the men loyal to the king, Charles I, and his traditional legal prerogatives and powers, against those whose wish was the erasure of all property and wealth distinctions. So possessed of their own nonsense were they, that they could provide no answer to the king's many questions as to their justifications for opposing him. They had been so convinced of his being held hostage either to malevolent advisors or temporary madness or some such, they realized in court itself that they had been whipped up into a frenzy on false pretenses, but they followed through with the killing of the king anyway. But in making allies of those blind to obvious realities, they found the proto-liberal levelers on one side, who insisted on the total equality in matters of law and rights, and then the proto-socialistic diggers on their other, demanding common ownership of all lands. This is to say nothing of the many types of religious radicals, including all manner of iconoclasts and delusional fanatics. So on the one hand, we have men preserving what is and was good in their treasured state and society, while on the other, the utopian tries to throw it all away in the misguided pursuit of a false perfection. The result of all that, given the success of the revolutionaries in the civil wars, followed by the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, was that our constitution, slowly at first, became one where the king was permanently in slumber. We still expect the king's peace to be maintained, the protection of his people and their ancestral liberties, and the good administration of his estates. But instead, we have a series of regents and custodians acting in his name, ever more brazenly corrupt when their actions continue to go unpunished. It is high time that the king was awoken. Let us return to theory for a moment. Even the restoration of lost virtues is far more attainable than the whimsical demands for revolutionary new men who are rationally perfected. Take the Romans, for example. They could call back to Torquatus, whose discipline had him execute his own son for insubordination; Cincinnatus, who twice fulfilled his duty to his country and twice returned dictatorial powers to the Senate; and Marcus Furius Camillus, who always led Rome when asked, and exhibited both prudence and good judgment in Rome's early recovery from the Gallic sack. These are stable foundations because they always beg the question, and why could you not do the same, if not because you are too weak of will? At best, the revolutionary new man is a set of static and haphazard assumptions based on an idealized vision of man without a supposed corrupting influence. At worst, it is a way of papering over flaws in the model. The system is perfect. It is man who will bend to it. At last, there is law, simplest of all. The restorer wishes law to be what it was, respected as it was, and enforced as it was. The revolutionary wishes the law to be totally remade from whole cloth and deliver on abstract principles, imparting them on wider society in the process, such as order, correction, or compassion. But a law so easily changed or ignored is not worth the kind of respect that is expected of it, even less so when it purports to remedy a social ill or presupposes a scientific solution to disobedience itself. There lies an obvious avenue for criticism of the law, and the law must be seen to be above that. It is the duty of the restorer to make it so. The process of restoration has no necessary fixed form, however, and it is worth cautioning against those who confuse means with ends. The great French Restoration, which came so close to returning France to its pre-revolutionary status, should caution us against being too afraid of white Jacobins, who would use the revolutionaries' own usual methods against them. If they are on the side of good, their methods are of no concern. They are allies all the same. It is due to distrust over means, all too often, that the prime weakness of great men are those lesser men who they find themselves surrounded with. But I, for one, will not be the one to stab in the back perhaps the last great hope of our people for a few pieces of silver. Meanwhile, men who would achieve some of our aims by means that appear allied can be the most dangerous of all. When otherwise noble men would dictate constitutional changes to a king as a condition for his return, they pretend to be a regent, merely holding the crown for the true king. All too often, these men are revolutionaries who wish to create anew under the mask of restoration. Though we have much to thank him for, George Monk fits this mould perfectly. As the man who was best situated to restore the Stuarts to their proper position after the Commonwealth, but refrained from returning Charles II to his full privileges and powers. Much like revolution, however, there are a number of ways that restoration can take place. For example, a coup among elites, either tolerated or enabled by the army, which is the most recognizable sort. Wide-scale, low-level disobedience is also possible, however, like strikes, protests, and non-compliance, such that vital functions of state or the will of the central government cannot be carried out. This also requires some amount of elite and army tolerance, but if it can pressure the authorities into resigning their position, it is the one which has the most populist characteristics. However, it will require a good amount of looking on by elites who could intervene and the emergence of a coordinating element who would become an elite as leaders of the faction if they don't already have accepted leaders. Indeed, higher-level rebellion and coercion, which can involve fewer men, may achieve the same results. Assassinations and terror campaigns, or even the threat of them, have kowtowed many men. As an aside, though, not that I believe we would really be left to our devices in this regard, so perhaps not the best idea. Manipulation of procedural outcomes is another option, often by retaining the legitimacy of a body, Parliament, for example, while either perverting it from its original purpose from inside or by changing the existing membership. For example, during Pride's Purge, when undesirable MPs were simply not allowed inside Parliament, thereby ensuring Parliament's compliance with the revolution. Similarly, Tony Blair's dismantling of the House of Lords by abolishing the hereditary peers, most of whom were Conservative incidentally, and then going on to stack it with loyalist life peers. Or an intellectual shift, for if the minds of enough incumbents can be shifted towards the revolution, then perhaps there need not be a changing of the guard. If the government is won over to the revolution and subsequently change course, then simply on the basis of outcomes, it is no different than if they had been replaced by the revolutionaries. We might consider the less earnest avenue of bribes and blackmail to be the same, but they are captured and enthralled to the cause. Whether the methods be cynical or honest, it matters not. A distinct, geographically located group is the final option, most often an army, but not always, who declare for the cause, and then they must either defend their position, asserting themselves as a new polity, but true to their vision of how the country should be run, or they conquer the state as though from outside. Indeed, it need not be constituted of natives, either manned by foreign auxiliaries or mercenaries. The results will be the same. So let that caution us against being too omni-focused on the magical 51% in demography terms. These need not be exclusive of one another, and for the greatest chance of success and the requirements to make the changes stick, the restoration may need to include as many as possible, but success is certainly possible with just one. For our purposes, these may seem insurmountably grand requirements. Take heart, though. History is replete with examples of such things being achieved by a few committed men with dedication and noble hearts, and unfortunately, some of evil men with just as much commitment. It is therefore imperative that we be the more driven faction. But with these means in mind, what is one to change? The specifics of the task will be unique to the situation, but for a broad sense of what might be included, specifically for a restoration, and at least with the rhetoric of revolution, these consist of constitutional restoration to reverse unjust or unwise changes, moral restoration back to a proven moral strength, or at least to set back on a path towards moral improvement. Property restoration, to return confiscated or stolen property, or an acceptable equivalent. Legal restoration, to strip away all but the true laws of nature or the heavens, or simply to reimpose a law that was just and good, but is no longer enforced. Natural and patriotic restoration, which restores either a people to their home or the return of a home to their people. Virtue restoration, finally, may be one of the more dangerous types, as it is easily derived entirely from the abstract. But if true heroes of a people can be presented who embodied the virtue in its purest form, which was once widespread but is now lost, then it might be considered worthy. This is far from a complete list, but the list is not incidental. Who are we if not a people whose constitution lies in tatters, who permit and spread all manner of degenerate moralities, ruled by a state whose disregard for legitimate ownership and exchange is only matched by its desire to take and squander that property itself? Our laws, once held in high regard, are now a joke. The home of our ancestral forefathers is ever more overrun by the day, and the conquests of our ancestors are stripped from us. And all the while, our leaders display nothing of our historic virtues. They are rightly looked down on for how they got to where they are, and they are not heroes, and no one will remember them as such. Our state wears a crude mask of continuity, as it always has through its revolutions, but it is indeed both fallen and hollow. These are the days when Rome claims sovereignty, but the edicts pour forth only from warlords. The laws of old and those of nature and the divine realms no longer hold sway. As yet, the aqueducts and bathhouses have not yet crumbled, but in time they will. To tip my hand, we are in our own heroic age, and, like post-Roman Britain, one where the old certainties are gradually melting away, and the field is opening again for new stories and new heroes. While all these categories and types can be useful for ordering thinking, the restoration is never simply a mechanical or systematic process. It entails heroics, struggle, and sacrifice, leadership, belief, and unselfish fidelity. It will always mean struggling against the boulder, perhaps already falling, and against entropy to preserve what is good in the world for a few generations more. And that is enough. To demand everlasting perfection is to demand the kingdom of God on earth. To be truly prepared, then, we must first humble ourselves as to what is possible. Constitutional legal attempts at restoration alone are often insufficient. To put it in Pompey's words, stop quoting laws, we carry swords. Likewise, moral restoration alone, like that of the Great Awakenings, can be channeled by all manner of corrupt laws and demagogues to foul ends. The emancipation of the slaves after the American Civil War is one such case. No one save the former slaveholders themselves cared to help the slaves after their freeing, and so they were left to starve. Restoration by alliance fails because all too often, the ally will seek to establish only his own advancement. The White Russians opposing the Bolsheviks and the pro-Ancien regime Knights of the Faith in post-Napoleonic France both discovered this to their dismay. Power as such is required, and is thus contingent on both coordination, born of a conscious network, and capable direction with a strategy. Perhaps it will be a strategy which is emergent, but certainly one that is coherent. All of this ought to be self-evident to this audience. The restoration must comprise an elite of sorts, perhaps on the periphery of current institutional structures, but a group which is a natural elite, quietly exceptional in their means or pursuits. A wider net might be cast, but that depends on the strategy desired. And in many cases, the great masses are incidental, not core to a restoration. Success, meanwhile, is associated with great men. Aurelian's piecing together the fragments of Rome, Arshad I's traditionalist Persian revival to create the Sassanid Empire, John the Restorer's snatching Portugal from the maw of Spanish integration, Cardinal Ruffo's ruthless rooting out of revolutionaries and liberals in the Sicilian Sanfedismo, Franz Joseph and his likewise uncompromising refusal to grant liberal nationalists and revolutionaries any quarter before surrender, Saigo Takamori's single-minded dedication to the emperor and the greatness of Japan, which inspired generations of Japanese soldiers. In all these cases, a single man was the leader, organizer, and avatar of a common desire to put things right in some way. But, far from following the crowd, they were foremost advocates of the Great Restoration, who themselves served to advertise the cause better than any single argument. The blueprint for what success looks like is already there. So despite our Sisyphean task, we can not only point to what we want to achieve, but also to those who have done it, and how. Unlike the revolutionary, we know it can be done, if we, as the good and rightly guided men, simply apply the correct means at the right time. If we fail, then the next generation will try again. The revolutionary, instead, must have some success, else they will descend into doubts and squabbling over minutiae. Such is the nature of utopia, all too often. There are as many utopias as there are men to imagine them. Ultimately, they will always be unsuccessful, because their utopia is only in their minds. Even in the event of some success, their desired perfection will remain out of reach. The best they can do is melt down their inheritance and squander it on baubles until there is nothing left to corrupt and pilfer. The key, then, in all of this, is that the restorer be rightly guided so as to not fall into utopian or revolutionary tendencies. The surgeon, murderer, and butcher are separated by intent and outcome, not by means. And just because a doctor applies medicine with a syringe does not mean that everything contained within one, nor even everything that a doctor might inject, is healing medicine. A peasant mob might be righteous champions of the good, while a noble or even the king himself might, knowingly or not, serve to further an evil cause. I emphasize this point because disagreement over an appropriate strategy is the single biggest cause for the failure of a restoration. What matters most is that they are rightly guided towards the good, and that there will be mutual trust that all are working towards a common goal of restoration. More than that, even when the restoration is achieved, we must perhaps still be there to ensure that the elite stay on the correct path. So what are the correct aims? Aside from the observation that great men will lead it, what is the true path to restoration? For that, I would suggest we have grand tales and myths of restoration, which represent common cultural touchstones among a people and lay out a half-conscious framework of expectations. This quality of providing a pre-constructed, even perennially true roadmap is where there is true power in the mythic restoration. The Greeks have one of the more famous examples of this phenomenon. During the fall of Constantinople, when Emperor Constantine XI realized that all was lost, he tore off his imperial regalia, then dashed into the fray to die alongside his soldiers. But he didn't, so goes the myth. He was carried away by angels, hidden and preserved in marble beneath the Golden Gate, until the time comes for him to be awoken. His return would herald the liberation of Constantinople, the driving back of the Turks to their homeland beneath the red apple tree, and soon after, the return of the holy city of Jerusalem to Christendom. His crowning once again inside the Hagia Sophia will prove his imperial legitimacy. As much as this may all be written off as just a story, it has real power. Whatever her reasons for doing so, Catherine the Great of Russia tapped into this myth as part of a policy of imperial aggrandizement. She accepted many Greek settlers and concentrated them along the Black Sea coast in new cities boasting Greek-inspired names. She had her grandson named Constantine and drummed up a political campaign building support for a restoration of Byzantium. Ultimately, the Orlov revolt that followed was not successful, but a fire was lit which was not so easily extinguished. Those same cities which had been created and fired up in support of the Byzantine restoration continued to organize after Russian interest waned. Eventually, they were successful in generating enough enthusiasm for a general Greek revolt in 1821. This time, they were at least partly successful, and modern Greece was born. But this is not the only time the marble restoration was attempted. In 1868, a son was born to King George I of Greece, named Constantine. Officially, come his reign in 1913, he was Constantine I, but many instead gave him another, much more provocative name, Constantine XII. Those first years must have been electrifying. In the early years of his reign, Greece regained Thessalonica, Macedonia, almost all of the Aegean islands, and Western Thrace in successive wars, and the Turks were almost totally driven out of Europe. But this time, it was also not to be. Trapped between his personal loyalties and the fanatical drive of his people to achieve their destiny, he resisted the calls for further conquests alongside the Entente in World War I. He was forced to abdicate, but once again, his promise maintained a momentum all its own. Even his Republican opponents had to provide their own answer for where the red apple tree was located to legitimize their own plans to bring the legend to its final fruition. But Constantinople remained out of reach. There was no Constantine to lead them, and so their bid was once again unsuccessful. While the ultimate aim remained out of reach, the strength of the myth is clear. It mobilized incredible dedication and support, binding together many into a common goal who would not otherwise be so quick to cooperate. Not only that, but even the enemy was forced to take it seriously. more than a century and a half after the initial fall of the city, the Ottomans would still not permit even a single piece of stone be removed from the Golden Gate, long since walled up to prevent the return of the Marble Emperor. In such cases, there is no question of whether the restoration should happen, or whether it will, only when. In the words of the Greeks, though the Turks know it as well, you will come as lightning. When a myth and prophecy are both spread and confirmed like this is the essence of what it means to live as a providential people, to be the protagonists of history and reality, for whom other peoples are simply obstacles and punishments to be overcome. So this begs the question, what is to be our mythic restoration? In truth, there can only be one answer: King Arthur and the mytho-history of his kingdom, appropriately sometimes called the Brythonic heroic age. Invaders, once invited to serve their hosts, now turned on their masters to take whatever they can and assert their own right to the land. The law, once just and imposing, now almost non-existent, subsumed into politics. And whatever chance there might be to restore order is squandered in the vices of those who might act and internal division between them. I'm sure I need not make more evident the comparison to our own time. In Arthur's day, so cameth the hour, so cameth the man. He was born of old Britain's royal blood, but was separated and lived a humble early life among his people. Only when the throne was vacated was he able to prove his royal pedigree and legitimacy. By withdrawing Excalibur from the stone which held it, he was revealed to be the true heir, to which none of the knights of the realm could argue. Under the tutelage of the wizard Merlin, he gathered the finest knights of his people around him, both friend and former foe alike, and bound the realm together in alliance. More than that, he restored the just order and allowed for men to be raised by their virtues and actions, not their vices and immorality. The proper hierarchy was restored, and the invaders humbled and brought back into line, if not evicted. With that, Britain once again became a land of order rather than arbitrary violence. From there, Arthur and his knights completed new conquests and individual heroics, until dissension and betrayal spurred a civil war, which mortally wounded Arthur and killed many of his knights, and forced him to take refuge. He promised to return when he is most needed. Again, also the story goes, which is to not give this tale the gravitas it deserves. For hundreds of years after the purported events, Arthur is the unsurpassed benchmark against which all other knights are measured. Even 1,000 years later, the return of Arthur presented a powerful momentum to would-be restorers, and the legacy remains with us today, through institutions and a history undeniably moulded by attempts to fulfill the Arthurian promise. When Edward III sought to rebuild the culture of his court and solidify the developing English identity, it was the Arthurian legend he looked to. His Knights of the Garter were one of the first wave of secular chivalric orders, tied not to the church, but the monarch, and dedicated to pursuing knightly virtue, to be models of chivalry. To not merely be a knight or lord in the service of the English crown, who might just as comfortably serve the French throne, but truly English knights. The comparison to the Knights of the Round Table does seem to have been conscious, but more references than that were not pursued, not least because Edward perceived his militarized subjects more than his knightly companions to be his source of strength. He seems to have toyed with the idea, but never fully committed to whether he represented a restored Arthur or not. As such, it forms a core part of English identity and a secular counterweight to many of the other strictly Christian, and thus somewhat more universal, symbolisms and iconography. We English are, in no small part, defined by our ties to Arthurian Britain. The second attempt at Arthurian restoration was much more clear-cut. Henry Tudor made every effort to prove his legitimacy through referring to the Arthurian legacy at every turn. His blood was royal, but he proved it through his deeds. He restored order and peace to the realm, and he sent out questing expeditions. But more than that, when he landed to make his bid for the throne, Henry made sure to add the dragon, long associated with King Arthur Pendragon, to his main standard. Furthermore, his firstborn son and intended heir to the kingdom was named Arthur, in a deliberate gesture of prophetic fulfillment. In those days, when the romances and histories of Arthur were enjoying a renewed renaissance, the anticipation among his subjects must have been palpable. Tragically, however, it was not meant to be. Arthur died at the age of 15, and at his funeral was displayed the coats of arms of Brutus of Troy, the founder of the Arthurian dynasty, and indeed the founder of Britain itself. The kingdom was left to Henry, Arthur's older brother, and as such, though a seemingly convincing attempt, Arthur's return was false, or at least unfulfilled in its entirety. And so for us, much like the Greeks, it falls to the third attempt to complete the prophecy. Unlike Edward, we have no reservations about the inherent elitism of the myth. We know that only knights will be up to the task of completing the restoration. And unlike Henry, we do not face a starting point of exile in foreign courts, with perhaps the greatest task being simply to return home. We are already here, and I dare say, strong enough to overcome our true enemies. Were we not locked in squabbling amongst ourselves and beneath the yoke of false leaders acting as the archetypal corrupt regent? Even within the Arthurian myth, before Arthur, there was Sir Hector, Sir Bedivere, and Merlin. There was Camelot and a round table. We have much to be building and preparing. Perhaps an Arthur will reveal himself to us as we build a worthy seat, or perhaps we will have to search him out as Merlin did. But regardless, this is no call to wait for a hero to save us. King Arthur's most important strength was his ability to bring together the greatest men of the realm in brotherhood, then lead them as the greatest and best of their number. He was and will be the culmination of legitimacy by law, blood, ability, and consent. So long as we are conscious to look for him, he will be his own legitimating force. We never cease to produce men worthy of the kind of respect the old tales would have afforded them, true knights. So let us set loose our artists to sing the songs and frame the legacies of our more recent knights. Especially now, when heroism seems far away, we should identify those whose dauntless will encouraged them to great feats and the pursuit of honourable ends. I know not whether there will be another Gawain, Galahad, or Percival, or whether the returned Arthur will take new knights into his retinue, but they will be knights all the same. And we ought to accept the challenge to aspire to such glories again. Let our builders lead the creation of a new Camelot, a refuge for the loyal, and a place to hone and test each other's mettle. Whether a physical place or spiritual, whether a public bastion or a private citadel, it must smooth the way for knights to ascend, and, ultimately, for Arthur himself to take his seat. Let our mystics, like Merlin and Morgana, search out Arthur, legitimize and rightly guide the king when he arrives, and tutor and guide those in need of it. Perhaps even to inquire into which quests would best befit a knight of our times, and discover the nature of the Holy Grail, the ultimate achievement. As well as all these things, we must make ourselves capable and useful as comrades in arms. For whatever else a knight is, he is a warrior first, in pursuit of the good and just, in peace if he may, but by force if he must. But who is Arthur? What was and will be his character? With perhaps minor changes on his return, he will be a level-headed and dutiful leader. He will be able to move past his own foibles to build bridges with his knights, and become an avatar for the court and the realm. He will be dutiful and impartial, able to deal fairly and justly with all, and earn the respect of all around him. His knights, meanwhile, are more incendiary characters, an eclectic mix of figures who more purely embody a particular type. From Gawain, the impetuous and uncouth warrior, to Lancelot, prim and royal, or Percival, the naive but persistent and ambitious. In the absence of Arthur, they cannot help but fight amongst themselves. Such are their strong and clashing personalities. But beneath Arthur, and sat at the round table, where all are given due respect, they can thrive in the service of the realm. The requirements of a returned Arthur are steep, and so to aspire to his position is certainly not something to war over. Any man who is too sure of himself will fall short, as he lets too much of his ego shine through. But so too must he be willing to boldly grasp his duties, and not be too humble or reluctant. So we must remember that he will be a very special sort indeed. Rather, prospective knights should look within themselves and discover, then hone the qualities which will spur them on to nobility and good knightly conduct. To find the archetype which best befits their qualities, either one of the original knights or a newer hero. They whose deeds would earn them the title knight and place them at Arthur's table had they been born in his day. Men like Robert Clive, John Nicholson, and David Stirling fit the bill perfectly. As well as all else that you might contribute to the restoration, this is the most immediate individual contribution that can be made. Find these qualities and this purpose within yourselves, then sharpen them and bend them to be useful to the cause. If it is possible to build a new Camelot and a new generation of knights without Arthur, then what is the purpose of looking for him and insisting on him? Firstly, because again, without him, the realm is not stable, and infighting pervades. Arthur, as the best among respected peers, is a unifying figure who, according to the tales, is the difference between stability and outward conquests or destructive civil war and the deaths of the finest men of Britain. And secondly, because it is buried deep into the cultural memory of Britain and foundational to our collective cultural consciousness. To mention Arthur and the Round Table has a much greater significance and conveyance of meaning compared to a more simple knight or trying to convince on the basis of abstract models. To talk of and identify the arrival of a Merlin or Arthur is to grab a powerful tool for understanding our position and implicitly what our aims ought to be. Even our enemies talk of who are the true Arthurian heroes, much as the Greek republicans made their case for the location of the red apple tree where the Turks will be driven to, we will have already succeeded in much of our task. We can and must create an atmosphere where our victory is palpable, certain even, and would mean beauty beyond compare. Like the Greeks on the cusp of their marble restoration, where in the electric atmosphere, all is swept aside before our momentum. There will be no need to convince anyone of the merits of our restoration. It will be obvious. Our dream should be to answer questions concerning how we prevent another betrayal like that of Mordred or Lancelot. What is to be our holy grail, or how to prove and test one's knightly virtues? I have answers to these questions, but they need not be absolute. The questions I do not care to answer are those of the marginal tax rate and healthcare policy. Such managerial concerns are beneath us. We are building greater things than a rational utopia, fulfillment of a millennia-old prophecy, to measure up to the old masters and rebuild a realm worthy of British blood and sweat, a brotherhood worthy of loyalty. Our first collective task, however, is to capture the imagination of our countrymen, enchant them with the promise of the restoration of our pride and our glories, the promise of new achievements and a new brotherhood, but definitively and inseparably British. English, even. Not something to be picked up as a mere fashion item, but a part of our exclusive inheritance, which can be either embraced or forgotten, but never traded or sold. A horn blows from inside the mists, sounding from the White Isle of Avalon. We have only to hear it. Once men believe that Arthur is to return, our options will open, and a path will be laid out before us, either to find him and achieve the restoration, or to begin it ourselves, to smooth the way for the return of our once and future king. At his back, we shall reconquer our home, reclaim our birthrights, and resume the grand ambitions that were and will again be our ancestral destiny. So, let us begin.
First questions?
First of all, thank you for the talk. Not sure how much of this sort of thing you've done before or to this many people, so well done on getting through that. What I took from that sort of more generally, because I'm trying to apply this to the question of the event, right, to practice and everything else. It sounds to me like you're proposing replacing the rational utopian vision which we see from a lot of our enemy with an irrational utopian vision of a similar stripe, and then you want us to one adopt a kind of knightly cast and then somehow convince the rest of Britain that Arthur is coming back. This to me seems a little unrealistic, and not just because I think we're devoid of spirituality, but also the English as a people are kind of, we're stubborn and cynical, right? It's very hard to get us on board with things, unlike the Greeks. So I guess my question to you is that a correct interpretation of what you're trying to say? What is the overarching message of your talk?
I suppose what would you categorize the Germans as being? Would you put them in the same vein as the English, or are they more? In what way? Well, I asked the question because the Germans have their own version of this myth. The monomyth is called the King in the Mountain, if you're curious, and the Germans have tapped into this as well because they've got their own. Their figure is Barbarossa. There are some threads that can be linked in to what significance that represents for the figure of Barbarossa, who is going to come and save the Germans in their hour of need. So I'm not necessarily saying literally that we need to wait for the blood descendant of King Arthur to come and help us, and we're going to build a castle in the meantime. It's something to be taken slightly more metaphorically, perhaps, but it's something which still has very definite direction and gives you a set of parameters to measure your success against. Like there are very particular problems that Arthur faced and that we faced likewise, and so using this tool seems like a very quick and easy shorthand way of saying, we're back there again. Arthur's going to come and help. And this is something that repeats probably more often than you're aware. So there is a slight undercurrent of this with the Norman invasion. There's an even bigger undercurrent of this with the ascension of Henry II, the first Plantagenet king. It comes back again with Edward III, as I said. It comes back again with Henry Tudor, Henry VII. It comes back again with Charles II. So we're working in a very, very reliable tradition of this idea of somebody who's going to come back, put the realm right again, restore the law, expel the foreigners, whatever it might be, and get England back on the right track.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent and very rousing speech. I think all the Englishmen in here have got a sort of slight flutter in their heart now, or I would certainly hope so. Apologies to our foreigners and those of a Celtic persuasion. I totally agree with you, sort of taking things more metaphorically. I think one of the great strengths of England is that we really sit upon sort of, 2 millennia of a continuous story, which is very, very rare for a nation state to go back quite that far. It's really only us and the Chinese who can claim to be that ancient a nation. And one of the things I think really with the modern English is that they've been told to be disconnected from that past, and it's become apparent, I think, in talking to people over the weekend, there does seem to be a split between people who are abstractly reactionary dissidents. They've read all the foreign literature and they understand power mechanisms and things like that. And there's other people like myself, and I venture to say you as well, who just want to be English. And I think at the moment we are living in a country that is inconsistent with its own past, and we need to get back to things like that. So do you think a lot of us need to sort of leave here this year as dissidents and come back next year as thoroughly ensconced Englishmen who believe in its own past?
Yes, in a word. Ideally, there would be some other things that are tied into that, and I'll pick up another part of the question that Mark asked, because ideally, what we would be able to go away with is an idea of this archetype of the knight, something which is much more specific than an elite and an aristocrat, and somebody who is much more in the right-wing tradition and perhaps more recently than you might think. So, for example, I made very brief reference to the Knights of the Faith. Now, that was in the early 19th century, and they were incredibly effective, incredibly dedicated, and pretty much true to what the vision of the knight is. They were defending the faith. They were ready to do violence if they needed to. They were prepared for that, but they were first and foremost like moral paragons and men of action and means. And so something like that, and someone who is able to act on their own and come with more like results, display results rather than theory and resources, basically.
First of all, Alex, my dad would not allow me to leave this room without mentioning, you said 2,000 years. I mean, this is a mere, you have to remember the King of Kings and the Code of Laws and Darius and ancient Persia and all the rest of it. But I just thought, it just so happens that this talk that you gave, I don't know if anybody remembers a while back I sent out a tweet, or my friend Roland Rat sent out a tweet. And I just wrote...
There's no reason why...
There's no reason to believe the king, because I was just doing one of those, like, you know, sometimes you get lost on a rabbit hole on Wikipedia, and I was like, hold on a second. There's a gap in the history, and you know, it occurred to me, actually, there's no actual reason to believe that this series, I mean, okay, it may have been embellished, but it may be real, right? And historians don't have a very good answer as to why to dismiss it. But it did make me think at that moment that I actually want to do some sort of series retelling some of these tales from the cycle. Obviously, doing it all may be a bit ambitious, but telling some of the key stories and then maybe doing some discussions afterwards. And you know, as the author of Foundations of Rhetoric and Knowing Persuasion Techniques, I thought I'd ask you in front of everyone if you'd be willing to kind of help with this project. Would you be willing to be part of such a thing? Yes.
Yes, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Hello there. So I'll echo what everybody else said. Fantastic speech, very very rousing, even from the us of the Welsh persuasion. Early on there, you mentioned quite a lot to do with the sort of a military atmosphere and a sort of a military theme. And it seems that basically a question that sort of popped up in my mind there was, well, is it worth at all trying to build power bases or sort of infiltrate at all in military institutions? Because it seems to me that a lot of the figures you mentioned, what they had in common was not just that they had the kind of metaphysical backing or they had the kind of legitimacy, but they had the hard force to back it up. I mean, you mentioned, for example, Colonel Pride. You know, he was able to clear out the House of Commons with, you know, a small sort of regiment of troops. He didn't, you know, you don't need very much power to do it. So basically, as I said, the question is it worth attempting to build power bases or outreach in military institutions for the hard power?
Okay, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer would be we could get into it more later off the camera. The slightly longer answer would be yes, and I suppose one of the things that could come through from some of the things that I said is the idea that it is something that's projected at everyone, and it is to an extent. But the important thing is to be able to bring certain elites on side, because to give and to be able to give them the sense that they can be part of this grand like rebirth, and they can be establishing themselves in English history. And that is, I dare say, something that's probably going to be quite compelling to a junior officer.
Thank you very much. That was so enjoyable and excellent over here. I was struck listening to you with the parallels with C.S. Lewis's novel That Hideous Strength, where have you come across it at all?
Say that again, sorry.
C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength.
I'm afraid I haven't.
So the heroes of this are a small band who are up against a technocratic globalist elite who seek to take over the world. And in their view, the true spirit of England is Avalon. And they frame themselves as a group that have as their leader a descendant of King Arthur, who their victory is a return to true Englishness. And Lewis contrasts this with the idea of Britishness, which he sees as, in the novel, it's presented as the spirit of technocracy. Do you see King Arthur or the Avalon kind of myth as specifically English and against Britishness, or where's the line drawn here?
No, so one of the interesting things that I think about the story itself is that there are various blood and marriage ties to basically every part of the United Kingdom. And so although we would associate him with being something of a Brythonic character, which puts them into both the English and the Welsh camp, he also does have ties within the story to Scotland. And so in that sense, you can kind of have it either way to a certain degree. He is definitely more of an English folklore character, but within his own story, he still has very strong ties to Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom.